Today, we're kicking off our live election day coverage with our partner NTD with a special live episode with three absolutely brilliant thinkers. Brownstone Institute founder and Epoch Times senior economics columnist Jeffrey Tucker, scholar of language and culture and Brownstone senior fellow Tom Harrington, and Inner Compass Initiative development director and mental health advocate Cooper Davis. This is the first of a series of today's live streams, so stay tuned. So today, to start off our election day coverage as people are heading to the polls, we're going to deep dive into the state of an America amidst a paradigm shift. It's a very different landscape than 4 years ago. Welcome, everyone. So to start us off, I want to basically give us a little bit of food for thought, some fodder. Americans are actually a lot more united around some issues than I had suspected. And this came through in a recent New York Times piece. I'm actually going to read from it. It's very relevant to some of your work at Brownstone. So here's the quote. COVID changed and scarred America. Desperation set in for people who thought of themselves as financially stable or middle class. The frustration we heard in our early focus groups in 2022 metastasized into anxiety in 2023 and intensified into anger in 2024. Listening to them, I stopped seeing anxiety. This is the reporter saying this. I stopped seeing anxiety and anger as two separate and distinct emotions. They were one and the same by the time the presidential general election began this year. So many people talked about their lives before and after COVID that it influenced how I saw Mr. Trump's chances and Mr. Biden's challenges in this election, and how those challenges inevitably shifted onto Ms. Harris. And I guess this could have been language that was said by a media, let's say, on the other side of the spectrum, one of these challenger media. And the other thing that I keep thinking about is that a full something like 80%, when you look across the different polls in our own work and talking to people on the street, the top issue by far for people is the economy, is the economy. And of course, there's a big connection with what happened in 2020 and onwards. So Jeffrey, why don't we start with you, as you are our resident economist for this chat?
Well, let me say, first of all, I think that's a brilliant quote from the New York Times. And I'm glad that they're dealing with this bluntly and openly and so forthrightly. Because it was a trauma. The COVID and the response really changed everything, in part because it was class-based. So the professional classes were treated one way and the working class was treated another way. And we were all invited to divide ourselves between essential and unessential. Nothing like that has ever happened before. And, the essential workers were put in front of the virus. The unessential workers and the laptoppers were permitted to hide from the virus, right? And nothing like that has ever happened. And that created a new awareness of class differences among us. But you want to talk about unity. One thing that will absolutely unify a population is inflation, because we all use money, and the value of money affects everybody, the rich, the poor, everyone. Not all in equal measure, but very equally in observation. We've all seen the prices go up and up and up, and people are very sensitive to price increases. Inflation works like a tax on the population. So it's like taxes have gone up, just systematically without anybody raising them. Our dollar buys fewer goods and services, which is what inflation is. And there's no escaping that. There's no state governor that can make inflation illegal in my state, kind of thing, right? So it's affected everybody profoundly, with a great deal of mystery about where it's come from, why it's happening, how to stop it. And for the first time in my living adult memory, we're actually having a debate about that subject. What is the source of inflation? And what should we do about it? And there are many theories extant, but at least we're having open discussions about it. We've got to fix this problem. And you think back 3 years. So when inflation became obviously an issue, following the helicopter money of 2020, it was probably about spring of 21 where inflation began an issue. And they said at the time, well, this is just transitory. That was the word that they used, which is a funny word. And no reporters asked Janet Yellen, what does that mean, actually? We just assumed it meant temporary. It's not what it meant. And it's just persisted and persisted. And there's a wide agreement, I would say, among almost everybody that it's been far higher than reported. Under the official data, it's about 20% over 4 years. But unofficially, that does not fit with industry data. And we've learned that CPI excludes most of the things that went up the most, like housing prices and interest and insurance. And once you roll those in, then you're looking at inflation closer to 40% or even more in some areas. That is a dramatic change in a mere 4 years.
And so, let me go to you, Tom. You're you're a cultural scholar, a resident cultural scholar here. But what is the impact of that writ large on society from a cultural perspective?
I think it's really interesting that the word trauma has come up here a couple of times. And how we all administer trauma is a very interesting and dark thing. Some of us respond to it immediately. Some of us bury it for a long time. It's an overused term, I think, in many ways in our society. But I think in this case, it's very real. And I think what makes it so complicated is that much of the trauma was delivered in the clothing of beneficence, of people being kind to each other. And yet, in being kind, they were oftentimes excluding other people, moralizing about other people. They were making other people feel less than welcome. And the buzz of being a good person, I think, has worn off, because that was the language that was used to make this possible. And some people are saying, was I really a good person? Did we really do those things? And if so, what was I really doing? And the people who felt the butt end of that, if you excuse me, the ones who felt the brunt of it are saying, well, you're damn right I felt marginalized. You're damn right I felt less than a citizen vis-a-vis some other people. And how long it takes for one to work through that in a hyper-mediated world is a very interesting question. I think one of the things that goes on in our lives now is that nothing sticks. I was talking with a friend and he said, you find out one thing and you think it's going to be a breakthrough fact, and then tomorrow it's forgotten and nothing sticks. And in order to work through something that has upset you greatly and that affected your life greatly, you need time, and you need time for contemplation. And our current way of living with the electronic devices we have doesn't always allow us that time for contemplation. In fact, it makes it darn near impossible to have that time for contemplation. And so things, I think, are oozing out of different places in the lives of people. It's an inchoate sense of something being very wrong, and yet without the institutions and the time for contemplation of our own to work through it, it kind of floats there, and it oozes and it seeps out. And I think that quotation kind of suggested that how one thing led to the next, and now it's anger. And I suspect there's going to be more anger coming. I think we sadly are probably at the beginning of the process of converting this trauma into anger. And that's not a happy portent, but I think it may be where we are.
Well, and this is a sort of a perfect moment to segue the question for you, Cooper, because this is, you've been working in the realm of mental health, we'll call it that. I know you don't like that terminology, but by most measures, we're in the midst of a major mental health crisis, and there's there's this mediation of technology. Absolutely, that's having an impact. There's the whole trauma that we've just been discussing of the last 4 years. That's of course had a very significant impact. We've been tracking it for 4 years here at Epoch, and so this is just this kind of underlying symptom. No one's saying that mental health is one of the top issues in the election, but somehow it feels like it's actually incredibly important.
Well, I think that when they do talk about it, it's generally understood as a bipartisan issue. Both sides will very easily concede, we have a mental health crisis in this country. As far as why we have it, or what to do about it, there's quite a lot of disagreement there. But I think that, Jeffrey, when you point out that inflation is something that affects us all,
Yeah.
right? It could have the potential, like a war, in years past, certainly, to unify the population because everybody's affected equally. I think that what's different about things now is because on my smoke break, when I'm flipping burgers at McDonald's, I'm able to read the entire Wikipedia entry under inflation. I'm able, in my pocket, I have, the condensed knowledge of human history available to me, which then leads to, not just our felt sense of something like inflation, but it's so much easier to come to hugely disparate senses of who's responsible for this. Why is this happening? How big of a deal is it? And so where at one time shared struggle could have been unifying, the fact that the pandemic occurred in the midst of probably, in my own opinion, the most significant upheaval to human civilization that we've gone through yet. I think the agricultural and industrial revolution sort of pale in comparison to the enormity of what's happening with our iPhones and iPads.
That's really interesting.
I also think, Coop, that there's another factor, and we could leave it to the viewers to decide where they come down on this, but there's a sense that there's a active torpedoing of norms in the midst of all of this, that some force out there is torpedoing norms, with norms that provided refuge in previous times for when we were feeling bad. Norms having to do with family, norms having to do with who you can turn to, norms having to do with all sorts of issues in life. A lot of these things seem to be floating in the air and open questions now. And the last thing you want when you're reeling from a traumatic experience is to find out that all of the touchstones of your life also seem to be unstable in this moment. And I think that adds an element to it.
Yeah.
And some people believe that this is intentional. I'm not willing to say whether it is or not, but there are certainly a number of people in our society that are convinced that the torpedoing of norms is yet another thing, and that it deepens their sense of aggrievement over what's been lost.
And that might account for the what I'm seeing as a sort of the growth of nostalgia for the past in architecture and clothing and music, and a sort of a rise of, I guess, first time in my life I've seen a rise of what you would call like traditionalism, or curiosity. What did people do about this in the past? What were the norms? What were the behaviors? How did people get through this in the past? And part of that relates to what you said, Cooper, about a digital technology. I hadn't entirely put those things together, that the pandemic and the response happened in the midst of a gigantic technological revolution that's changed our lives. We have now, for the first time, a growing skepticism about the digital age itself and our extent of addiction to social media or devices. What are they doing to us? They used to be miracles and forces of emancipation. Now we're starting to see our phones as a threat. Like why did I used to think this is my friend? What if it's actually my surveillance device? What if this is the thing that's going to take away everything I love?
Yeah.
I've changed my own outlook on all this stuff. My view today is completely unlike my view 5 years ago.
I think that connects with another theme, which is, what are the limits of secularity, or with secularity, the limits of the idea of linear progress, which, if you think about it, has been an implied religion among us here in North America for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think there's a sense that we may be arriving at the limits of what the rational mind can deliver us, deliver to us in terms of betterment of life. And I think that will feed into nostalgia. Just think of MAGA, Make America Great Again.
Oh yeah,
there's nostalgia in that. And of course, the people on the other side often say, well, that proves that this is a fascist movement, because all fascist movements
revanchist.
Are revanchist and have an element of nostalgia
But
in them. But I don't necessarily say that that's true. But there's definitely a nostalgic element.
Yeah.
And I think with it, there may be a feeling that that we're arriving finally at the limits of American power in foreign policy.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole bunch of things that are crumbling, or at least giving the suggestion of crumbling around people.
And when you say progress, you don't mean just technological progress. You mean like social, cultural, everything.
I mean, even the concept of time that we use. Sometimes we talk about time, but we don't talk about how we talk about time. Many different cultures believe time is cyclic, circular, spiral, or otherwise.
Sure.
But we all grew up, I suspect, believing it was linear.
One long thing. Yeah.
And when you have circularity or spirality as the metaphor, then you can turn around and go back.
And this is sort of, I mentioned the paradigm, with it, we're kind of amidst a paradigm shift. There's all of these different, it's kind of hard to tell cause and effect, but obviously the technology has a profound impact, right, on all of this. We've just been discussing it. I've been thinking lately about how these phones are really just kind of, they've become extensions of our minds, and they're in some cases, way too close. Yeah. Way too close. You have to kind of make the conscious decision to put it away. But really, it opens up all these incredible opportunities, but it also creates a weird kind of, you become a slave to it in a weird kind of way. And all of this is happening in the context of all these social norms changing. I mean, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is media specifically, right? And just how it's almost, one of my favorite writers right now is Andre Mir, who would postulate that polarization is the software of media today, that it's just it's a natural progression of how media are structured, that it kind of pushes us into these basically bubbles of sorts, right, into these things of independent canisters. And is there a way to communicate again after that? I don't know the answer. I'm very concerned about it.
I would just throw out here, I mean, I think all conversations like this one, anytime it happens nowadays, it sort of inevitably moves in an apocalyptic direction, right? There's a feeling of it's hard to see what happens from here, regardless of where you're identifying threats from. But I would actually, I think if we can really zoom out on this, you can, personally, I think about technology the way you might think about a drug. I think it's an apt metaphor. And with drugs, at one dose, it's medicine. And at another dose, the same thing, it becomes a poison. And because this is so new for us as a culture, we have not developed etiquette. We haven't developed manners.
That is true.
Around how we use these devices.
Or personal discipline.
Personal discipline. And it really is about, the device is it's the medium, but it really is the sheer glut of information. And to me, when I hear "Make America Great Again," or you have in trends, it's like, it's not postmodernism. It's not just a pastiche. Pastiche implies like an irreverence when you're referencing the past. There's a reverence here, or a searching, or a hope to go back to something. I think that's a pretty universal thing. I think it's to go back to a time where you knew less stuff. You were obligated to keep track of less things.
Or at least to have some kind of mental filter or personal filter for what you let in.
We're not designed to walk around day to day with a working model of the entire planet in our heads. Right. And yet this is where, and then we're surprised, there's a mental health crisis. That's a lot to keep track of. And it comes at the cost of your immediate environment. Yeah. Your neighbors, even your own health and well-being. Oh my God, there's too much going on. I can't go for a run today.
Two things come to mind listening to you, Coop. Could the sense of apocalypse also be the flip side of linearity? Could it be in other words, it's either going to be great success, or is it's going to be apocalypse? And if you have a different sense of time, or a different sense of how culture progresses, you have the ability to turn off the road and see it in less stark terms. Yeah, that's one thing.
Or integrate the past into the present in some way,
As far as, Jan, you're speaking how we get out of this, that's where I become at the risk of sounding nostalgic, maybe sounding simplistic, we know the solutions.
Yeah.
We know the solutions are to talk face to face, look at other people, touch other people, laugh with other people, reflect on things that you've done together in friendship that bond you and that have formed you. All of these things are incredibly powerful and incredibly able to give you the power to fight on. And I think it's interesting. The other word, the opposite of that, is, of course, is alienation. And the mental, and maybe you could speak to this from a mental health point of view. We're seeing a lot of alienation. And yet it may be simply because the skills we once took for granted, which is sitting around a table, talking eye to eye, laughing, being sarcastic, if you want, if that was part of your group's code, however you laughed and established bonds of complicity, it's right there for us to do. But it means getting off the train. It means being very conscious about what that apparatus is doing to you and saying, this is not life. There's a wonderful writer, Matthew Crawford. I don't know if you've interviewed him or not, Jan.
No, I just recently met him.
Yeah. He's a terrific, I think he has great insights into a lot of what's going on. And he talks about us being embodied. All right, we have embodied existences. And what these apparatuses do is they basically say, we're not embodied. We just have a brain and we're hyper rational all the time. Our bodies tell us a lot of things. And bodily, sitting face to face with bodily communication is also very important.
Yeah.
Because
I should say, Tom, I don't know if it's the right place to say this, but you practice what you preach here. I remember it was a few months back, you invited me over to a dinner party and you didn't tell me who else was invited. And when I arrived, there were a vast number of people. I'd say, 12, 16, something like that. And I kept wondering, what brings all these people together in this one spot? Well, it just turns out it was all classes, all perspectives, different professions, people from all over the place, just sitting around talking together in a comfortable environment. And it was for me, there's an element of constant, unrelenting discovery throughout that evening. And it was delightful because it wasn't one point of view, it was many points of view.
I think this does, when we talk about mental health and alienation, I mean, especially with younger people, there's a whole, this Gen Z has come up in a world where these things, they don't know a time before. And they don't know a time before, having the ability to go online, pop your favorite things, your favorite movie, your favorite whatever into a search bar and find a community that is dedicated to, deep Talmudic exploration of that hyper specific little thing. These subcultures can exist. Global subcultures can spring up out of nowhere. So I think for a lot of younger people, they have, in a lot of ways, what feels like unlimited choice who they want to associate with. They haven't lost the ability to sit down and have a conversation. Maybe they have in person, but they have instead developed the skills to do it with a total stranger. And then I think where it starts to get difficult is you lose a sense. You meet somebody online for the first time, you're reading them first through their profile. Stuff you would normally have to find out through conversation. You would wend your way through it and find points of connection, points of difference. Instead, everybody's writing an advertisement for themselves, and that's your doorway.
Instead of being kind of forced in many cases to have to, of course you can choose and ultimately not to interact with someone, but especially in a small community, it's kind of the opposite. You kind of have to deal with people. Right?
But this is what you just said. This is to me, the beauty of human relations is finding out the story and the path through which you find out the story.
Right.
I have this wonderful quotation from Vinicius de Moraes, a Brazilian poet. He talks about the art of the encounter. That to meet other people is an art form. And if you take it seriously, the way you take seriously many other things, you find out, wow, how can I get to know this person? What will seep out? What is repeated? What comes back? I credit my grandmother, born in 1990, for a lot of this, because she, quote unquote, subjected us to a lot of stories, which I hung on every word. But she also would tell different stories, or the same story with a different set of slight changes. And your job as a listening child was to piece it together. And I think you see this also in our treatment of information now. People expect that knowledge comes packaged, when in fact knowledge is always a scavenger process. But if you haven't been subject to conversations which have no linear order, and you haven't had the need to pick pieces out to create the whole, you're going to have a hard time doing that with a text in front of you. And this is what I think gives rise to categories like misinformation, because it exists on the premise that there is packageable, knowledgeable, absolute truth that will summarize everything in the true way.
Yeah.
And doesn't this kind of what you're describing now seem very kind of in some ways opposite to the nature of our political discourse today? That's what I keep thinking to myself. Like we don't seem to have that.
That is for sure. It's funny when you were talking, Cooper, a word came back to me suddenly, one of the worst words to emerge out of the COVID years: touchless.
Oh, absolutely.
It was like a norm.
Well, not only was it normal, it was said, and we have touchless.
We have touchless.
A requirement.
As if I wanted that.
Yeah. So that's if that's the goal of life, is to touch as little as possible.
Yeah.
And it applied to in physical interactions with people, but also interactions with the physical world. So now we have technology, so you can just sit in one spot and yell at something, and it calls your lights to go on and off, or the car to start, or whatever, And so the goal is just to not touch anything, except your little device. Yeah. And it's creepy.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, but just to give a little bit more context, if you've had the experience of living with someone with Alzheimer's, which is the winnowing away of a person before your eyes, you begin to realize that touch is not an additional thing, not a secondary thing. It's a primary thing about who we are.
Yeah.
We touch. We need to touch. And it's the thing that when you see that person's mind going away, you can grab their hand and you can see the calm come over them as the confusion in their brain abates, simply because they know there's someone trustful and it's being expressed through touch. Touch is amazingly important to us.
Well, it's important even in our households. I mean, what in the world is wrong with getting up and turning on a light? Or turning off a light? Why should we regret that? Or getting up and turning on the stereo instead of yelling at something all the time? When I got rid of my home assistant, I felt a very strange sense of emancipation. Yeah. And I had loved these things for years. I was like, oh, here's the magic new technology. Finally, I just got fed up with it, and took it outside, smashed it with a hammer, and threw it in the trash.
But that gets sorry.
And it was a happy feeling. Now suddenly to go over and turn on music, to turn off your lights, to reject smart, what they call smart technology in favor of physical things, is wonderful.
I think it's one of those things where there's a novelty, which explains a lot of the early adoption.
Yeah.
But in this case, this might sound like a bit of a stretch, but just try to stay with me here. I have a home app on my phone, and I can do some things. I can see who's at the door. I can put the thermostat up and down. I can control the volume on speakers and whatnot. But as I was setting it up, I was seized by this desire to I want to control more with this. I want to have more, from this little command center. It was a kind of a hunger. So that's present on the consumer end, and I'm not really clear on what's going on. But then you have the, on the supply side of all of this, I think that there's an awareness. Apple makes a phone. Apple makes the software that's running the phone. Apple makes the software that talks to all these appliances, Now your engagement with your doorbell is on some level mediated by Apple.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean they're necessarily extracting, a couple fractions of a
But it's
penny
weird.
out, but there's something happening there. So I think there is this huge incentive to increase the umbrella. And it's very similar to what we see in the mental health treatment world, where more and more aspects of everyday human life are being brought under the umbrella of a medical problem. So the medicalization of normal human day-to-day interaction, especially ones that aren't going that well, you now have the option and plenty of people who will assist in an effort to take this problem you could define in many different ways, but just really drill down on the medical version of it. And because there's an insurance code that goes with it once you start doing that, and so now you feel like you're getting help to deal, and you're taking it seriously because there are professionals involved now. Whereas if you just go down to your parish priest or Uncle Jim,
or open up a book of home remedies,
then you may, and it extends well beyond what you traditionally consider to be the core of health. You're talking about social interaction. You're talking about resilience in the face of difficult, life changes.
What you really were talking about is the offloading of agency, right? What the technology has to in common with all these things is these new technologies and new diagnoses are basically offering us the possibility to offload our agency in the battle of living a good life. And if you take it to its, look at the physical, if we could all sit on the couch, but what would that do to our bodies eventually? We'd become flabby people sitting on a couch. We would lose certain physical abilities. Well, we've got to be very judicious about what we offload in terms of agency. That famous Jordan Peterson book that I think made his name about, was it certain habits?
12 rules.
12 rules. Like that. What that's really saying, as I understood it, was there's agency. And even doing small, apparently meaningless things imbues you with a sense of agency that is contagious. And you could leave your bed unmade, but making it and creating a stasis and a calm in your room leads to certain mental dispositions. And it makes you act upon the world. And what we're being offered, I think, by a lot of this technology and a lot of the agents, I don't want to use the word again, a lot of the institutions that are offering to help us unload our agencies, is the ability to not do those small things that you need to do to become the person you need to become.
And this relates to Jan's question concerning the impact of this on electoral politics. We're living in, this is election day, right? One of the most contentious, everyone says the most important election of our lives and so on. But to what extent are we using this election to further this alienation of our decision-making and the outsourcing of our agency to third parties? We're looking at these candidates to achieve all of our personal dreams rather than trying to figure out the ways in which we as individuals.
The amount of effort and energy that goes into shouting at the institutions, the much beleaguered and worn down institutions, shouting, demanding that they, do this, do that. Imagine if that energy were allocated towards a positive vision and just saying, we're not going to wait for you guys to do this. A great example, there was a recent fracas around Fruit Loops. And then, there's all these preservatives in American processed junk food that is not in European processed junk food.
Or Canadian.
And it's wonderful that people became energized and concerned about that. And they showed up to Kellogg's headquarters and they said, enough is enough. Like, we want, we don't want our Fruit Loops to include these particular, offending chemicals. That's great. But imagine if all that energy were applied towards an independent, rather than worry about what's in Fruit Loops, let's focus all that energy into a localist movement, into our nearby farmers and CSAs.
Yeah.
And that's very idealistic, and I understand,
but it can happen. It can
but
happen.
there's a version of it that just requires a little organization on our side, and to say, okay, you want to have a critical appraisal of the institutions, you're catching them, sleeping on the job. Just notice it, but then focus on getting the thing done that you want to get done. This is supposedly America.
Right.
How about just starting with not buying the Fruit Loops?
Well, yes, there's that too.
Right? Right? It's rather odd to have a big fear and say, you allowed these Fruit Loops into my house. Well, now that you know, don't buy the Fruit Loops.
No, I mean, I think there's room for both scenarios here.
Of course,
actually,
there is.
right?
Of course,
I mean, there's a different kind of agency, right? There's more local and more bigger, broad issue of chemicals in the food system.
Yeah. But there are ways to deal with that don't involve mediation of politics. You can find farmers markets, which is something I've started doing over the last year, and it's enormously satisfying. Growing up as an American, I used to always hear these legends about how the French would go out in the morning, they go to the butcher, then they go to the baker, then they would go to here, and I think, I remember thinking, what a waste of time these people. What's wrong with them? What are they thinking? Just create gigantic supermarkets, and you can get everything in one store, and you just do it every couple of weeks, and you're done with it. This ridiculous shopping is preposterous. But now that I've started doing it, I find it just tremendously delightful. Here's my store with the fish. Here's my store with the beef. Here's my store with the vegetables. And here's where,
and all these touch points with the people in each establishment. You're able to talk to the fish guy. You're talking to your butcher. You're talking to your baker.
And you talk to the farmers. I was at a farmer's market recently, and she, while we were visiting about the history of the farm and everything, she knows that the corn is running out. And she goes and whispers to her husband that the corn is running out. He hops in the truck and drives over to the cornfield and cuts some back and brings it back on the truck and replenishes. I watched this happening. Nobody said a word about it, or there was no celebration or anything like that. It was just part of their business. That's a delight.
We've got to be careful, though, because to do this, and this is one of the differences between the United States and perhaps other countries, to do this here means you have Saturday off to go to the market. It means you have time to read up on the poison or non-poison element of the food, and that you have the money to generally pay more for the healthy food. So one of the things that it's very difficult to eat well in this country if you're on a limited budget.
And actually, if you don't mind, let's go back to the inflation topic for a second. If we're going to look for a silver lining in this whole thing, and I hesitate to say this, but one thing that's happened over the last 2 years is that people have rediscovered home cooking, and found out that they don't know how to make anything. They don't know how to work their ovens. They don't know what a
Really?
I can't believe it. I know people of a certain age don't understand this, but I'm teasing. But there have been several generations raised with just eating everything out. But that's become unaffordable to do all the time. So people have rediscovered cooking at home. And I've written many articles now for Epoch about just cooking. And I tell you, the correspondence I get from those articles is more than any other.
It's
how to make a salad. It's fascinating.
But you can go, and this is where, I think there are a lot of silver linings. And I will, posit, we are on this enormous transition that we're going, where technology does seem like it's acting upon us in a lot of ways. We're in the middle of it. It's hard to get a sense for the big picture here. And I really personally feel like the utopian promise of the information revolution is still on its way. And we're in the midst of some growing pains, this crisis of truth and information. Where we're at right now is a particularly ugly moment. But the fact that I can go online, that I can realize I'd like to learn how to cook, and then I can
find redeeming facts.
How to cook, how to make a salad for beginners. thousands of options for what I can watch.
That's true. It's
All
true.
kinds
And you and I
direct
go back and
peer
forth.
to peer.
We go back and forth this whole time. And I don't want to become a reactionary in this. I used to be in love with the digital age, and now I've turned against it, you know. But I think what needs to happen is we need to civilize these technologies.
Yeah.
And I mean that seriously. You know, when I remember when the first time that cell phones came out, and to have a cell phone was a little bit of a prestige item. People would sit in restaurants on the phone talking loudly just to show off that they had a cell phone. I remember looking at that thinking, that's the most rude thing I've ever heard. I bet at some point we're going to develop a social norm in which that doesn't happen. And sure enough, we have, right? You never see that anymore.
Well, you go to visit a friend, and I have, especially younger people I know, say, hey, do you mind if I pull my phone out? I just have to check something. They'll ask before they bring it into a discussion.
That is true. That has changed. That's changed in the last couple of years.
I think a good parallel, imagine when the automobile became available as a mass market product, except they were very fast from the get-go.
Yeah.
Okay. Imagine they easily can, SUVs that can drive, 150 miles an hour over, hilly terrain, right? I think that's where we're at with these cell phones, with these devices. They have immediately become so good at what they're aiming to do. We have not created the infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure,
that's right,
to channel it in ways that are going to be useful.
Yeah.
And that's just that's time. You can't plan that.
Yeah.
Well, you can plan it.
You can plan it. Well, and certainly people.
But I like this idea of developing a personal social norms, but also personal discipline.
No.
But just to push back a little bit, you can plan culture. You mentioned the term civilization or civilized.
Civic life.
Civic.
You want to civilize the technology. That's what you're saying.
Civic, city, civilization are all interlinked etymologically.
Yeah.
You went to the city to become civilized.
That's true.
Right? But civilization necessarily depends on authority. And when you talk about authority today, people get hives when they hear the word, because I want to be free. I want to be an individual. But the fact is, one way or another, authority will assert itself in a culture. But what we seem to be in now, at a time when we need to create new norms, and to create new norms, we need authority. We have an allergic reaction to the very idea of authority. And that, I would argue, comes out of the idea of the enlightenment, that the individual is going to be the measure of all things. And the individual, to liberate the individual from what he or she needed to be liberated from, serfdom, was a wonderful thing. But we still need the glue of civilization to hold things together. And in order to do that, you need authority.
Yeah.
And in authority, a better way to look at it is it's related to the notion of authorship, right? Same idea. We're authoring a new way of being together. And there's always going to be some people in power that are going to be more the authors of those norms than others. But we need to come to an agreement at a certain point that authority is necessary. And we have an entire portion of our society that at the very idea of authority gets really nervous. And that's an interesting phenomenon to me. You can't have civilization without authority. You don't want it to be a rash authority. You don't want it to be a capricious authority. But you need it to be a wise and just authority. And how do you inculcate the idea again that some channels of authority are needed without setting off all the alarms that authority is per se tyrannical?
I think leadership and authority are not necessarily the same thing, but they functionally can be. And especially if followers generally choose their leaders, and they choose out of a survival instinct. They think this person is going to do the best and most effective job sort of directing and managing whatever needs to be managed in order to see my life have some stability and make some sense and move in a direction that is worthwhile for myself and my family. And I think, what I worry a lot about is that and this election is a great example. Is it possible in this very moment, is there anybody in the public sphere who is widely recognized as being a competent leader, politics or otherwise?
That is interesting. I don't know the answer to that. I think we used to have those, right?
Can we have it ever again?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because when I grew up, I think there were wide numbers of people out there that everybody agreed,
at least perceived.
You know, I don't know, it's a paradigmatic example, Walter Cronkite or whatever like that. But there were many others that were not seen as having taken the side in the great conflicts of our time, but rather, you know, just spoke with some sort of authority, and it had a broad view. I mean, we used to think of intellectuals this way.
Yes.
That's gone.
Maybe I didn't say it more clear. The idea seems to be today that authority is tantamount to demanding submission.
Authoritarian,
and authority isn't about submission if it's if it's wielded correctly.
Yeah.
The people who've had authority in my life, and I've been a somewhat rebellious person in many phases of my life, so it's funny to hear these words coming out of my own mouth. But the people who have exercised authority in my life, and who I love for the fact that they exercised authority at key moments in my life, were nothing of the sort. They didn't ask my submission.
They're stewards.
They pointed a way. They expressed a way of being. They expressed a way of looking at the world that I found attractive. And that's that, you know, the notion of charisma, not in the narrow sense. It's charisma of having a relationship with the world that demands implicitly imitation.
You know, Tom, I was just thinking as you're discussing, one of the things, thinking about the economy and understanding, you know, for example, from this recent Brownstone report about the kind of the realities around inflation, for example, and just, you know, the reality of the debt and the ever accelerating growth of that. And so there's just some point at which it's obviously clear that for there not to be great strife in society, there's going to be some kind of austerity measures will have to be, like, people will have to accept that it's not going to be as good as it was before. And a lot of people say, hey, it wasn't that good in the first place, right? But what it would be wonderful would be if there was a leader who could do something like, you know, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do with your country, instill that kind of, you know, civic virtue.
Prepare us for.
And I don't know, is that in the cards, right?
Well, that's not even part of our political culture, to prepare people for pain. You know, it's been 40 years since we've permitted a recession to happen, with the messaging that we have to go through this in order to prepare the way for boom times in the future. We have to clear out, you know, the mistakes of the past to get back on a growth. And that has been a change in my lifetime, that we no longer just recognize business cycles as, you know, just something that happens. We're forever fighting against them. You know, there's a recession, that's a bad guy, let's stomp it out with policies that end up creating even worse problems. So I would love to see, with some honesty, come back to in public discourse about economic realities
or equanimity. I mean, what you're really asking is there someone that that's seen as equanimous, who can ask these things? And then I got to ask a difficult question. In a winner-take-all society, or a society that is often perceived as being winner-take-all, is the quality of equanimity one that can naturally grow up? Because what I see happening, even when people seemingly are equanimous in their approach, the level of distrust that is hurled at them from people wounded by the scars of a winner-take-all society is great. And so they can't even trust the apparent equanimity of a person. What's his game really about, or what's her game really about?
Well, there you're touching on something really important, which is this whole issue of social trust, which that has been transformed in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
4 years. I mean, you look at, no matter what data you look at, it, there's trust in media, trust in medicine, trust in academics, trust in experts, trust in the politicians. Everything is fallen off the cliff. And what's interesting about that is that it's so across the board. It's not just government. It's not just media, but it's everything. It's
the armed forces, which for many years were highly
armed forces
respected.
Religious leaders. I mean, you just go through the list. So here we find ourselves with a very strange experience that I've never seen before, which is a society where there's been this widespread loss of trust in something. And Thomas Kuhn would call this period pre-paradigmatic. So we've had the collapse of one settled orthodoxy. There have been too many anomalies, and people trusted when they shouldn't have trusted. They believed when it turns out now that belief has been replaced by incredulity, and we don't know what's next. So that's and Kuhn describes this as pre-paradigmatic. We're looking back at one orthodoxy that's now gone, and we're looking forward, and we don't know what that looks like yet. So this is a major reason why we all seem to be at each other's throats and beating each other up so much because of these pre-paradigmatic times.
And is this, people keep asking me what I think is going to happen.
Yeah.
And I really have to say, I really have no idea. I mean, it's the first time I felt so that this future seems so incredibly unpredictable, other than what will happen will be astonishing. Maybe that's the one thing.
There will be a new paradigm. What Kuhn calls a paradigm.
I think there's another factor in all of this, and I'm going to try and bring it back to the idea of the limits of the rational mind. Mm-hmm. Any of us, if you have enough information, if you have enough information on any of us, you can pick and pick and pick and pick and create a narrative that is negative about any of us, because we're all fallen beings, right? And so we have this excess of information, and there's a certain point at which you can dig, and you can find ultimately a reason not to trust almost anyone in the world. So at what point do we all have to engage in a active discipline and say, I'm going to go only so far? For example, there are a lot of parents now that with phones are on top of their children in every aspect of those children's lives. And they're able to intrude in ways that were impossible before, even in the dating lives of their children, all sorts of elements of their children's lives that no one was intruding on my life. And the question that I had to face as a father with this available technology, do I want to take it to its logical, to the extreme I could, but what would I be doing to my children's ability to develop autonomously if I did so?
And what you're describing, Tom, is also at a societal scale, isn't it?
That's what I'm saying.
Exact same question, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Right.
So if we can do it in the family level, but we can do it to everyone now. And then we're going to find out, what are we going to find out? We're all fallen beings. Well, good for you. You're fallen, I'm fallen. And you've done bad things in your life that are annoying. You've done bad things in your life. We got nothing to believe in.
I do think something happened in this campaign cycle that, in my view, portends possibly a more permanent and significant and possibly positive change to how we as a culture appraise our leaders or potential leaders. And that is towards the very end, in the last month or two, both campaigns started turning towards long form podcasts.
Oh, right. That's a good thing.
And so what happens when you get on you sit down in a room without a teleprompter, without notes, you don't know what the host is going to say. You will make mistakes. You will put your foot in your mouth. You will look stupid. You will, all of these things will happen. But as it as more and more words are coming out in this conversation, each particular moment in the conversation becomes less determinative of the overall value of what you're saying. And what comes through to people is the quality of you as a person.
I'm getting to know you as a human being.
And so now, I mean,
The gotcha game gets minimized.
it gets a lot harder because, as you say, Tom, anybody can be made to look awful. And you know, for a very long time, all you really needed to do to run for office, to be a public figure, you need to be able to get up in front of a crowd, 20 minutes, 35 minutes, you know, hit the notes on the speech, and then get off.
The so-called stump speech.
Yeah.
And that does seem to be deprecated, doesn't it?
I think that this genie's not going back in the bottle.
Yeah.
And I think 4 years from now, whatever happens, you're going to see candidates who from the get-go are able to have a 3-hour conversation live, uncut, and come away seeming relatively relatable.
Yeah.
Will be the new sort of.
Do you think that's going to lead to a different kind of candidate in the future?
I think so. I don't think you can.
Person?
You used to be able to survive in the American political, you know, jungle without necessarily having the skills necessary to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it makes a better or a worse candidate, but it's a
different kind of thing.
It's a new basis on which to appraise people. Yeah. And it, in theory, it's a lot harder to pretend to be something that you're not in that format.
You know, we're sitting here with Jan Kellick, who almost alone preserved long conversations in media culture. I mean, over the last 5 years, you've been conducting long interviews with serious people, and has been a bright light in American culture for that very reason. You have open conversations just like this one, and so congratulations to you for that.
Very kind, Jeffrey. You know, we are actually coming towards the end of our day. It's amazing. I can't even believe that the time has gone so quickly.
Should have been 3 hours.
But, well, so maybe just like a quick, if I could get a quick sum up, and maybe since I started with Jeffrey, maybe
I will say this. It's a practical prediction that I think next year the recession that we're already in is going to become more obvious, and its solution is not being talked about in politics today, but we're going to have to deal with it. And I think, as you intimated, is going to lead to some pain. And I'm expecting the second round of inflation will hit us in the summer of 2025. And how that unfolds is going to be very difficult for people.
So you're basically saying whoever gets
elected, and I think we're going to have to confront a reality at that moment, which is that just because I cast a vote on a ballot does not make all the problems of the world go away. That's going to be tough. It's going to be tough.
Cooper?
You know, I think, to me, all of this is still, and I don't have a clear view of it, but I do think all of this is weighted down very heavily by the technological moment that we're in. And I think one thing that didn't come up in this conversation is artificial intelligence. And, you know, we're still in an age where some people hear me say that and they're rolling their eyes and like, oh, here we go. Because it's not yet really present. It's still kind of a toy. But that's changing very, very fast. And in the coming months, you're going to start to see ways in which these large language models are helpful aspects to everyday life for many millions of people are going to start to realize ways in which this can be useful. And I think that on this question of, you know, if every human is fallen, it will not be long. I think over the next 4 years, the next time we're all sitting down here to see who's going to be president, you know, the next term, a lot more people will be thinking in their heads, this would be so much easier if you just had a neutral piece of technology, piece of software calling a lot of these shots.
Neutral.
I've got 10 seconds for you.
One thing we haven't talked about here is what I think the impending debilitation of the U.S. presence abroad. Whether you wanted the war in Ukraine to go one way or another, I think it's very clear that there will be no clear victory. And I think that's going to have enormous reverberations, much like the economic ones that Jeffrey talked about.
Well, so thank you all for joining us today. And tonight, I'll actually be joining the Brownstone Institute watch party here in West Hartford, Connecticut. I'll see you all there. I'll be broadcasting from there from time to time during NTD's special coverage, live election coverage. And now to continue with our coverage, join Joshua Phillips' live stream on Crossroads coming up right after this by clicking on the link in the description below, and we'll see you all there.